Welcome to the Oral History Podcast, featuring stories from the oral history website voicesofoklahoma.com, where Oklahomans have given generously of their time to tell their life stories for present-day listeners and for generations to come. Our entire collection is available on the website voicesofoklahoma.com. Subscribe to be notified of new Oklahoma oral history podcasts. Here's another interesting storyteller from voicesofoklahoma.com.
In the summer of 1939, there was a little girl living in Lodz, Poland, who was looking forward to the first grade. It was while on the family summer vacation that Eva Unterman heard her family members quietly talking about Germany and war. They cut short their vacation and went home to Lodz, and soon little Eva was looking at black, shiny boots. The German invasion of Poland was underway. Listen now to Eva Unterman recall her days of how Eva's family was forced into the Lodz Ghetto, and after 4 years deported to Auschwitz, and then to a labor camp, and then forced to march in what was called a death march. May of 1945, Eva and her parents were liberated, survivors of the German Third Reich, which took the lives of 3 million Polish Jews in World War II. Oklahoman Eva Unterman tells her story to honor the millions of children whose lives were cut short by the Nazis, and to be sure the Holocaust shall never happen again. For Eva, the invasion of Poland begins when she is 6 years old, and her story is preserved forever by the generous donations of our founding sponsors on voicesofoklahoma.com. My name is John Erling. Today's date is October 12th, 2010.
My full name is Eva K., middle initial K, Unterman, and I was born in Poland in 1932, and I am 77 years old. Soon, God willing, I'll be 78.
Were you named after somebody in the family? How did your name come about?
My actual name at birth was Christina Eva Teofila Wolman, and as a little girl, I was called Krysia, which is a popular Polish name. I was also given, as is common, a Hebrew name at birth, and that was Chava. Chava translates to Eva. But as a girl, I was Krysia. And in my name now, when I write Eva K., the Krysia is for that little girl who lived in Lodz, Poland.
Where are we recording this interview?
We are recording it in my home in Garden Park in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I'm looking out the window here. The sun is shining, and I'm looking at a beautiful blue of a morning glory. I am enjoying that view very much.
Tell us the town you were born in.
It is in Polish Łódź. In English, it's Lodz, L-O-D-Z. And the Germans called it Litzmannstadt during the occupation of Poland.
Your mother, let's talk about her name, maiden name, where she was born.
My mother's name was Esther, maiden name Kaufmann, married name Wolman, W-O-L-M-A-N, and mother was born in Lodz, where my family lived for many years.
And your father?
My father, Markus Wolman, also from Lodz. He was called in Polish Marek.
What is that?
In the Polish language, names change. So there is a formal name, and then there is a name by which people are known. As I mentioned, Christina becomes Krysia. Markus became Marek. That's very common in the Polish language.
What did your father do for a living?
My father was a businessman. He actually inherited that business from his father, who passed away at a rather young age. And my father and his uncle had a wholesale office machines business in Lodz, the early office machines, which were typewriters and adding machines and so on. We were not wealthy, but comfortable.
And so then your mother was home taking care of the family.
That's right. In those days, most women did not really work outside the house. My mother was always very industrious and talented, and she was knitting and sewing and embroidering. never using a pattern. She had a great imagination, which we all admired.
Brothers and sisters?
I have one brother who was born after the war in 1948. I was an only child during World War II.
And what is his name?
His name is Eli Wolman.
Let's talk about your grandparents. They were a big part of your life. So
Yes.
on your mother's side, your grandparent.
I never knew my grandfather, Kaffeeman. He passed away. My grandma, Kaffeeman, Jochevet Kaffeeman, was very important in my life. She immigrated sometime in the 30s to Eretz Israel, Palestine, with her two sons, my mother's brothers, who were ardent Zionists. And Grandma Kaffeeman came to visit us in Lodz with a return ticket. This was just going to be a month's visit or so. That was in early 1939.
Because of the invasion, she was there then throughout your time.
Correct.
On your father's side,
Yes.
your grandparents.
Again, I didn't remember my grandfather Wolman, but my grandmother Helena Wolman, I remember very well. She lived with us, and I will tell you more about her life after the war. Both my parents were patriotic Poles. They were Polish citizens. We spoke only Polish in my home. They were looking forward to the future of Jewish life in a free Poland.
You're 6 years old at the invasion. What do you remember of your life prior to that?
I always like to remember that. Bits and pieces, really. I recall where we lived. I remember my nanny. I had a nanny, which was customary then in middle-class families. And she was a Christian peasant woman who lived with us during the week and spent her weekends with her daughter on a farm. This became very important to us as time went on. Her name was Furmankova. And she was very devoted to my family, and I loved her dearly. She had very long hair, and she allowed me to braid her hair. And as I'm speaking about her, I see her in my mind's eye, and remember going to the park with her and playing. And then what I remember most is the summer of 1939. When my immediate family and some extended family members, some uncles, cousins, we spent the summers in a little village near Lodz called Żakowice. And I remember that time so very well. We stayed in little cottages, very simple cottages, and the adults used to play cards by kerosene lamps in the evening on the veranda of the cottage. And I was supposed to be in bed, but I remember peeking through the door and watching and listening to what they were saying. I recall the lovely birch trees and tall sunflowers, and I would pick the seeds of the sunflowers and eat them. Very peaceful, very good memories. And my father used to come on a train from Lodz, and I'm really not sure if this was weekends or if this was every evening, but I recall running towards the train station to meet him. I was an only child, and my dad and I were very, very close. I recall that when I was sick, years before that, with whooping cough, my dad was the only one that I would allow to carry me as I was coughing, and he used to sing Polish military songs to me. I remember to this day every word of the Polish national anthem.
Wow. Can you do some of it here?
I certainly can. I won't sing it, but I will tell you the first few words of it. Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła, póki my żyjemy. How I remember this, I don't know, But the tune to it, I remember also, but I really have a terrible way of singing. It means, translated, that Poland isn't lost yet while we are living. Now, this goes way back to Marshal Pilsudski, who was a hero of many Poles and most of the Jewish population. So my early childhood was a happy one, from what I remember. Being the only child in the family, I was probably spoiled a little, but I was looking forward to going to school when we were to return the fall of 1939 back to Lodz. I remember that while the adults were sitting and playing their card games, and I was peeking in and listening, that eventually there was some whispering going on, and they told me I should go to bed. I had no business being there. They were talking in worried tones about something happening in Poland, a war perhaps. Germany came up. The German name in Polish was Niemcy. I remember that. And then eventually it was decided by the grown-ups that there was indeed some trouble on the horizon and we should get back home. And I was very disappointed to cut the vacation short, but indeed the packing was done in a hurry and we took a train back to Lodz.
We should point out here as background, while you were enjoying your summers there as a child, Adolf Hitler had become the Chancellor of Germany in 1933. And so, leading up then to September 1st, 1939, Germany attacked Poland, and Poland fell to the Germans within 3 weeks. So that date is what your parents were whispering about.
That is so true and so very important. Of course, as a 6-year-old, I had no idea what it really was that they were talking about. But I remember getting back to our home, and within days, I think, there were German soldiers in the streets of Lodz. And from what I have learned, the Polish army did try to defend its country, but they were no match against the mighty German panzer divisions. And there was some bombing of the capital of Poland, Warsaw, but not of Lodz. They simply drove in. And from then on, unbeknown to me then, our lives changed forever.
Lodz, where you lived, which is located in central Poland, and held the second largest Jewish community in Europe, only second to Warsaw. But then, as you've said, 7 days after the invasion, Lodz was occupied. By the way, I have to interject here, ask you, Justice Marian Opala, who just died yesterday, also lived in Lodz, and he was 19 at the time of the invasion. Did you ever meet him, or did you know that?
No, I haven't, but I heard on the news yesterday that he did indeed pass away.
Right, but you didn't know that you, both of you lived there at the very same time.
No, I didn't.
He was much older than you, of course.
And I have learned of other people who have lived there. And as time goes by, the focus used to be years ago on the Warsaw Jewish population. It is now, after all these years, the Lodz situation becoming better known. You mentioned that there was a large Jewish population in Lodz. Well, 230-some thousand Jews, a third of the total Lodz population, but the Jewish community, very large and very diversified indeed. Lodz was the Manchester of Poland. It was an industrial textile city. I learned these things. Of course, I didn't know when I was a little girl. I just knew my family and my friends. But within days, these German soldiers were everywhere. I recall when some came into our home and removed the chandelier that was hanging over the dining room table, and we just stood there, both my grandmothers, my dad, my mother, and I, totally helpless. They had total control over everything in the city of Lodz, and we Jews were singled out from the very start as the enemy. Edicts were given out, orders were given, and I recall that clearly. I was no longer allowed to play with my non-Jewish friends. I was not allowed to play in the park. All of us Jewish citizens of Lodz were not allowed to walk on street walks in the center of the city. And then I remember so clearly when we all were ordered to wear these yellow stars of David with the word Jew on all our outer garments, so that we could be easily recognized when we were outdoors, insulted, have rocks thrown at us, not only from the German occupation soldiers, but from some Polish hooligans. Many were anti-Semitic and saw this as an opportunity to insult their Jewish neighbors. Not all, but some did. Most of all, I remember how very disappointed I was that I wasn't allowed to start school. I was looking forward to it so much. I already had my school supplies ready. That was done before we left for vacation. But I wasn't allowed to go to school. And the life in Lodz, as in other occupied Polish cities, became very difficult. The ration cards for food were much smaller than for non-Jewish citizens. And we were so fortunate that Furmankova, my nanny, who had a daughter on the farm, would bring us milk, fresh eggs. I remember how thankful we were for it and how this was just second nature to her. That's one important memory of those early years after the invasion and occupation.
You have an image of your mother actually sewing that six-pointed star on your coat.
I do. I do, yes. I remember that quite well and asking, what is it? My mother just explained that this is something we had to do, and wasn't just my coat, it was my father's, my grandparents'. All of us would wear that. We were branded in that way. I also remember an incident that kind of sheds light on my mother's personality. As I said earlier, my mother was quite creative. She used to knit and do all these wonderful things. She also made pillows, throw pillows, out of felt. Her own design. They were on the sofas in our living room. And I recall this one incident when this German, I believe he was an officer, came in, looked around what he wanted to take, and his eye caught these pillows. He said he would take those with him. Well, what can you do? There was nothing we could do. We were totally helpless. So he took the pillows that were there. He came back a few days later. And he said that he liked the pillows so much he would like to order some. Where did my mother get them? And she told him she made them. So he says he would like to order some because he'd like to send them to his family in Germany. And my mother, this fearless woman, said, okay, she can make those for him, but she would need something in return. She would need some flour and some butter. I remember my father and grandmother thinking, okay, this is it. He's going to shoot her right on the spot. But you know what? He didn't. As a matter of fact, I remember his name. It was Deberle. And my mother made pillows. She would sit half the night at the dining table stitching the pillows. And Deberle, this SS man, I think he was, would bring the various items that she requested. So we always had a little more food. On another visit, some soldiers came in. They wanted to know where our suitcases were. They needed some suitcases. We're all standing there, and my mother declares We don't have any. And I recall thinking, but we just brought them back from Žakovice. How can she say that? And again, my grandmothers and my father thinking, what is she doing here? Well, he asked for the German word Koffer. And my mother's presence of mind was already then visible, because when he said to her, oh, surely you have some Koffer, she says, no, she didn't. So he said that they would search. He went looking, and of course he found the suitcases, and came back holding two that we just unpacked recently, and saying, and what is this? And my mother said, ach, das sind doch Valisen. It's another word for suitcase. She knew very well, and she was prepared, that when he said one, Koffer or Valisen, she would say that she didn't know that that's what it was called. So this presence of mind and this fearlessness is what characterizes my mother through all the war years.
The shiny black boots of those German soldiers was a big image in your mind.
Yes, and it is to this day. The first time I saw them was actually when they climbed up on a chair to reach for the chandelier. Shiny black boots, and I've seen them over and over again. A very frightened picture.
You see them right now, don't you?
I certainly do. I can see them right in front of my eyes. No matter where I have lived, in cold weather in different parts of the country, I would never wear black leather boots.
Then one day, you were told you would be ordered to leave your home the next day. What was going through your family's mind? Obviously, you wondered where you would be going, but what you would take with you. Talk to us about that.
Very important question, because indeed, we were ordered to assemble at a certain time, certain place. All these things were done in a very efficient, methodical way. And there was no escaping it. People often ask me, why didn't you just run away? Run away to where? With whom? Who would hide us? And what about my grandmothers? No family. My family, anyway, would leave with a child and two grandmothers and run. Run where? When that order was given, I remember it so clearly as if it were yesterday. My mother and others used sheets to make bundles and to take their belongings with them. They were lighter and you could pack more in them than in suitcases, even though some of the suitcases were actually taken away from us. But I recall Mother making these bundles. And she would put some blankets, sheets, a comforter, some pots and pans. We all had a bundle. And the evening prior to leaving, my family and I believe a couple other neighbors had an idea. They were going to bury some of their family heirlooms, some precious belongings, in the courtyard of our home. And, of course, claim them after this madness was over. This couldn't last long. We would come back. So they buried, I don't know exactly what, but some silver pieces and other things in that courtyard. And I was told that I, too, would have a bundle that I would carry. I had a beautiful collection of dolls. And for each birthday, my mother made a new wardrobe for them. I was an only child. They were my playmates. And they sat on a deep windowsill in my room. And I was told that I could take only one. Well, I didn't know what to do, because in my child's mind, they were friends. And I couldn't separate them. And how would I take a favorite one? So I turned them all to see the street, and I told them to be good. I will be back probably soon. And I took this little old rag doll with an odd Polish name of Bodwiga with me. And then we had to leave. When I speak to young people in schools, I always ask them, how would you feel if you were told to leave everything behind? Your grandparents' photos, your parents' wedding pictures, your prized possessions, and just walk out of your home, which is indeed what we had to do. And I remember it was so cold. This was winter 1940. My mother put as many clothing pieces on me as I could possibly wear. Blouses, dress, sweaters, coat. I recall how stiff I felt in it. But this was to maximize that which we could carry, and also because it was very cold. We went downstairs and met others from our neighborhood, other Jewish Polish citizens, as we were told to line up in the middle of the street, and there were the soldiers with their guns and the big dogs at their side. We were told to walk, I remember, to our right. This was a transport from this particular part of Lodz. We didn't know where we were going. And I remember some neighbors looking out windows, some standing in the street, some just staring, not knowing what to make of it. But there were some who were actually applauding. They were glad to see their Jewish neighbors leave, so that they could rush up to our homes, our apartments, and take whatever they wanted before the Germans ever got to it. And we walked for a long time. It seemed to me forever, and I remember how cold it was. And then we reached a part of Lodz, dilapidated, old part called Bawudi. We were taken to a building. We all of us, I don't know how many people there were, but we were assigned a room upstairs. And I remember rickety stairs, dingy, dirty, no inside bathroom facilities. But my mother, the most resourceful person that I think ever been, at least in my life, and that's a word that Holocaust educators need to remember. You had to be resourceful to survive. Mother found an old cot in that room, opened it up, and out from her bundle took out a clean sheet and pillow and that comforter, and that would be my bed for 4 years. We were all in the same room, and that area, Bawudi, was closed in with different fences, and that became the Lodz Ghetto. It meant absolutely nothing to me, but I was told by my mother, this will not last long. I've heard that repeated over and over, because if the world just knew, someone will come to our rescue.
Define the word ghetto. We know what it means here. I think it has a different meaning there. Isn't that true?
Yes, it is. It was really a prison. It was totally sealed off. At the very beginning of it, Furmankova, my nanny, tried to bring some food to us, but that was stopped when the ghetto was totally sealed off. And the Germans, of course, ran all this, but they appointed a Jewish administration to carry out all of their orders. The Jewish administration at first tried to open a school, a hospital, even some concerts were performed, anything to keep us in some human condition, not to allow us all to be so humiliated all the time. But that didn't last long. And this is important, unlike in other ghettos, factories were set up by the Germans in which people worked for the German war effort. This is an important part in my particular story. Food became so scarce. People were starving eventually. Didn't happen overnight, but it did. In order to have any food, one had to show that a person was employed. Again, we were lucky. My mother found a job in a soup kitchen, which meant a great deal. And my father found employment also. I stayed with my grandmothers, and my grandma Wolman died in the ghetto. She died in a bed, surrounded by her family. She could not get used to what happened to her life, and she became ill, and she passed away. So there were my immediate family, and then I had some uncles and aunts. And if I may, I'd like to say little about the ghetto, because they were transports brought to the Lodz Ghetto from all over Nazi-occupied Europe. You could hear every language spoken. And people were also taken out of the ghetto to be resettled. And because the starvation reached dangerous proportions, especially for children, the Germans announced, and I'm using Germans instead of always Nazis, because those in charge were the Germans. They had others, Poles and other people carrying out their orders. But that came directly from the head of the ghetto and from Himmler himself, that children could be resettled to a better place, more food, better living conditions. And of course, parents seeing their kids ill and dying from starvation agreed to it. I mean, why not? Any normal person would allow that, except no one ever heard from the children again. And people became suspicious. And I remember then that when people didn't give their children, the SS came through the streets of Lodz looking for children. There was a hunt, I don't know any other word to use, going on for Jewish children. And I remember once when the word got around that they were coming, they made no secret of it. They were proud of what they were doing. But my mother and a couple other neighbors had a plan. There was a dried-out water well in the courtyard of this building. They opened the lid, a ladder was put down, myself and a couple other children went down there. The lid was put back in place, and when the adults felt that it was safe, this action was over, they brought us out. I remember it was dark. It was scary, but my mother told me to go down there, and I trusted her.
So you were 7 years old by this time?
No, I was probably more like 8.
Okay.
Or 9.
So 3, 4, 5 children down there?
I don't think there were as many as 5. I believe there were like 3. It wasn't that large a place. And we just stayed there. We didn't ask questions. We just did what our parents told us. And what I have heard and read about, that even very young children sensed the danger. Their parents didn't tell it to them how dangerous it was, but they followed their parents' orders. So I remember that incident quite well.
The children were taken because that was the future.
That's right. The children, Jewish children, all over Nazi German-occupied Europe, were one of the major enemies. As you said, children represent the future. And in order for genocide to succeed, the children in the minds of these evil, horrendously, I don't want to say the word crazy, because they were not crazy. They were doing this out of some impossible conviction that they were going to give the world the gift of a world free of Jews. In order for genocide to succeed, the children had to be eliminated. I have since learned that over 1.5 million Jewish boys and girls were murdered during World War II.
You spent 4 years living in that ghetto?
Correct.
Were you educated then in the ghetto?
At the very start, I joined the school, but I don't remember it even, except bits and pieces. It didn't last long. I would like to mention a name of a young man who I think I remember, but I am not sure. And that is David Sierakowiak. He became a very real person in my life, my adult life now. And chances are that I actually did meet him. It was about, 15 years ago, when I was in an old Borders bookstore in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I love going to bookstores and going through the bargain tables and always looking for anything that has anything to do with the Holocaust or the Shoah. I prefer to use that word often. I came across a book, The Diary of David Sierakowiak from the Lodz Ghetto. I took that book, of course, I turned the pages, and there, on a page, totally at random, was a photograph of my mother that is now displayed at the Sherwin-Miller Museum here in Tulsa. I couldn't believe my eyes. There was my mother. I tried to trace where that photograph came from. I believe it was Mendel Grossman, who was a photographer there, that took photographs at random in the street. That had to be early on, because in the photograph she still looks like a normal person. She looks like herself, the way I remember her from before the war. So I read, of course, the diary, which is really part of the diary that was found in an apartment in Lodz and kept by someone, and parts of it were used to heat a stove during part of the war, but those parts that were found were edited and published by Ellen Edelson, and it is called The Diary of David Sierakowiak, who died in the Lodz Ghetto of starvation and tuberculosis, a brilliant young man who was only 18 years old. So when I speak about particularly the Lodz Ghetto, I always speak in memory of David Sierakowiak.
You didn't realize as a child, but as you reflect on it and spoke to adults, did your parents know how the Jews were being treated in camps in Germany, that they were being annihilated? Did they know that at the time?
There were rumors, I have found out, but no one in their right mind could have imagined any such thing. Mind you, that is before CNN and various forms of communication that we now see as events happen. There were some rumors, and I didn't know about them because in the middle of all this, I was still very protected by my parents.
And then one day, you were ordered to walk to a nearby train. I'm going to say this is about 1943.
No, this is actually 1944, early fall, late summer of 1944. Of course, there was no choice, and we could again take that which we could carry, and there wasn't much left. But we again had the bundles, and we went to the train station. We were one of the last transports to leave the Lodz Ghetto. There were rumors that it's being liquidated. People will be resettled to better conditions. That's what I believed. And that is what my mother led me to believe. If she really believed it, I don't know. But she convinced herself in a way, and me too. And who could have imagined anything worse than the Lodz Ghetto? It had to be to a better place. So we assembled at the train station. There are the black boots and the dogs and the guns. A few people did manage to hide in the ghetto in some cellars. A few young people who were healthy enough to do that sort of thing. Very few. And we were ordered to get onto this train. But this wasn't a train like we usually took to Żakowice or anywhere else. This was a cattle car. Most people listening to this have seen on documentaries the trains that we were transported in. And I recall the door was so high off the ground, my father lifted me, and we got into the train, and we were pushed against the back of the train further and further. As many people as they could get into each of these wagons. It was covered. There was a little barred window on the very top, and some people could see a little bit of the sky or something that stood near it. We were just pushed, and they were yelling at us to go further back, to eventually we just stood against each other. No one could sit down. There was no room. And then we stood what seems to me like forever. I remember to this day the sound of metal hitting metal as their doors closed. And we were as tight as we could be against each other. There was a bucket somewhere in the corner for bathroom. And people were whispering. Some were speculating, maybe the rumors they heard, maybe there is some truth to it. Oh, no, others would say. Children were crying. People were praying. Some people became ill and kind of slid between us. We started moving, and it's the sound that I remember of that steam engine whistle as we traveled to an unknown destination. We stopped, it picked up speed. I don't know how long we were on that train, but eventually we stopped.
The stench on that train had to be
tremendous. It is the sounds and smells that to this day I recall more than anything else. And when I speak about it, I can see, feel, smell it. But I have been so fortunate over the years that there is some kind of a protective, I don't know what to even call it, that I can talk about it and not break down.
Through all this time, there must have been the questioning, the 4 years in the ghetto, and then you're on this train. But why are they doing this to the Jews? What did we do? Why do you not like us? All those questions had to have been obviously being asked by the adults.
Oh, there were discussions going on all the time. And it is the Jewish tradition from ancient times to now, and it will always be, that people ask questions and argue over it. You know, there is this saying that if there are 3 Jews, there are at least 6 opinions, because we are encouraged to question and to discuss. Now, as I said, I was always very protected by my parents and maybe my own psychological makeup. However, I must say, especially in Poland, there has been anti-Semitism for years and years, and people went through it and recovered and then went somewhere else. Since I have been studying and trying to understand some of my personal background and the larger history, Jews have been dispersed ever since the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, all corners of the world, until there would be an outbreak of anti-Semitism, and we, the Jewish people, had to leave and go somewhere else, whether it was Spain or, all over. And in Poland in particular, there has been, I was told, much anti-Semitism perpetrated often by the Catholic Church. The Poles were mostly Catholic. Now, mind you, having said that, there were individual Polish Catholics who on their own tried to make and did make a difference. And I could tell you many so-called righteous among the nations, but there was anti-Semitism, which was very fertile ground for Hitler to embrace this and use this common hatred to propel the Third Reich into existence. So that's my explanation, and history bears me out on that. But I want to get back, if I may, to arriving in that place, which I didn't know what it was. Once we were made to get out of the train, I do remember these people, now those were SS, standing there and screaming at us in German, raus, schnell, out, quick, quick, and using their whips. And men and women were immediately separated. I no longer saw my father, but I stayed with my mother and my grandmother. And then as we got off the train, we were made to go to the right, where a selection took place. Didn't know what it meant, but the younger, healthier-looking women went to one side, the older, the sick, and the children to the other. We had no idea why. This was done very efficiently and quickly. We left all our belongings in the train, told that we would get it later. And we were made to run towards the right side, mother holding onto my hand. And we came to this large building. I believe it was made of concrete and made to go inside, where long tables were set up, where SS women were sitting. They were every bit as brutal as the men, and they were processing us.
Explain what SS meant.
Schutzstaffel, those were our guards. This was an elite unit of people who volunteered for it. They were there in all the concentration, death camps, and various labor camps. It certainly was better for them to be in charge of these poor Jews than go to the east and fight the Germans.
So then you were being processed.
Yes. And what did this mean, the being processed? We had to take all our clothes off. I had long braids. One woman grabbed my hair, cut it off, and the next one shaved my head. And that was done to all the women and the few children who were in our group. Then we were led into another building where there were shower heads overhead. We did not know how fortunate we were that water came down on us. After that, as we came out of there, we were given these coarse, striped, pajama-like uniforms and wooden shoes and made to go into a certain direction. Well, I know now that we were, which meant nothing to us then, in Auschwitz-Birkenau, a death camp, as it is now known. We were there shivering, running towards this barrack. And people who visit there now, I have not been there and have no intention of visiting, they're still the barracks as far as the eye can see. We were taken into one and made to spend the night sitting there on the floor. The next morning, we were marched outside, made to stand to be counted. That was a routine in all the camps called Zählappell. We were counted and then given a rusty bowl, which we were to keep. That is where our daily ration of food was poured in. And it consisted, of course, water, turnips, and potato peels. No spoons, mind you. We were not considered human. Animals don't use spoons. And my mother made me drink every bit of that stuff, and we learned to just eat it like that, directly holding that bowl to our mouth and eating it that way, and a dry piece of bread, which people ate. We were very hungry at that point.
Let's talk a little bit about Auschwitz, which was the largest of the concentration camps. There was Auschwitz I, which was the base camp. Auschwitz II was the extermination camp, and Auschwitz III, a work camp, 48 camps in all. They had these standing cells, starvation cells, dark cells, and you may want to comment on that. Was Auschwitz then in full operation while you were there? So the exterminating was actually happening in the so-called property area.
Yes, it was. And I should mention that as we, our fortunate group, went to the showers, there was a building that was built to the same specification where the old, the sick, and the children were taken. And instead of water, poisonous gas descended on them. They were killed, and then their bodies burned in the crematoria ovens built for that purpose. So you see, there were people running this entire machine, this industry of killing. They were people who were building the ovens, who were maintaining them, who produced cyclone bead. It was a business of killing people. There have been many tragedies in human history, and to this day, people are being killed for various unbelievable reasons, innocent people as we speak. But but there have never been death factories set up that were so well organized. That is what the Shoah means to me.
You're talking about 1944.
Correct.
The Germans were committed to the so-called final solution
Yes.
by January of 42, and September of 41, the gas chambers were in operation. They experimented on 600 Russian POWs, 250 Polish inmates, and gassed them September 3rd of 1941. So we established that. That was already in operation as you were there in 1944. So maybe I'm jumping ahead of myself here. Are you looking back then thinking, why did we not meet our end there at the extermination camp?
Oh, yes, for many years, until recently, really, until about 6-7 years ago, I always asked myself the question. I actually felt guilty telling people who came through the camps as the only surviving member of the family that I was with my mother all the time. If I have time, I certainly want to explain how this came about, which comes a little bit later. It is a most unusual story, but I have learned why it is that I, as a child yet, survived the selection and survived being in Auschwitz for a short time.
Okay, then you refer to the fact that you were moving on. Why didn't you meet your end there, and why were you selected to move on?
Well, I think that maybe if I can briefly tell from then on, it will become clear, and then I will speak about it. We were taken to a concentration camp, Stutthof. I don't always tell this story, but I will for this interview. It was every bit as awful as Auschwitz, but less well known. And it was in Stutthof that one of the worst memories occurred. We were sitting on the floor in one of the barracks. They were all built to the same specification, long, low buildings, divided lengthwise in 3 sections. The center section was the Lagerstrasse, where mostly SS women would march up and down and beat us and scream at us. Then there were on both sides these bunks, which really were shelves. You've probably seen them in a documentary film. Well, that one evening, my mother and I sat on the floor in front of those bunks, mother and I and other women, and my grandmother Kaffeemann sat across the Lagerstrasse on the other side with other women. We were already undernourished and not doing well physically, when from the left side, I remember that, here come the black boots. And they were spiffy-looking, clean-looking, starched uniforms, some young men. I believe that one of them at least was an officer. Maybe they all were. To me, they were all the black boots. And he announced that he was looking for some volunteers to mend their socks in exchange for an extra piece of bread. I believe to this day that when my grandmother's hand went up, she was one of the first to volunteer. It was because she wanted to give this piece of bread to me. My mother later told me, as she held on to my hand, that she wanted to shout to her mother, "Don't," but she couldn't, because that would have brought attention to me, and I wasn't supposed to be there. As the women were led outside, one of the young men came back, laughing. He was laughing. There was no mending to be done. This was Saturday night, and these men entertained themselves by taking these women outside and killing them. I thought as a child that these SS men and women were inhuman. I thought they were monsters. It was much later that I realized they were as human as you and I. They had families, they had children, they had mothers, grandmothers. How on earth could they do that? Also, after the war, Most of those SS that were caught and other officials of the Nazi regime said that they were following orders. They were soldiers. They had to follow orders. Nobody gave these men that order. So I have, to this day, been dealing with the question, they were human like I am. How can we, human beings, behave that way, do this to one another? That is one of the reasons why I'm telling about it. Because normal people cannot possibly imagine it. That there can be such evil in human beings and such propaganda against the other that they're capable of doing this. That's the reason for telling the story. Now, it's just Mother and I, and we are again relocated.
And let me just say,
Sure.
You're obviously wondering where your father is. You
Correct.
had no contact with him at all.
Correct.
He would have been in the same camp area, but there was no contact at all. So you had that concern about him.
Actually, if I may go back a bit, in Stutthof there was an occasion, which I don't always talk about, but if we have the time, I'd like to mention. There was a Polish worker, an electrician, who worked on the women's side of the camp and over there, far away, the men's side of the camp. There were two parallel camps in Stutthof, men and women. My mother found out, she was always curious, always trying to find things out, that this Polish man knew some of the men on the other side. And through him, she found out that my father, very ill, was in the men's side of the camp. This Polish man who brought these messages back and forward was eventually found out and killed. But before that, this Polish man, in touch with my father, sent a message to my mother that on my birthday, which is late October, at a certain time, my dad would throw a wooden spoon over on the women's side. There was business going on. People would, for a piece of bread, they found a piece of wood, carve a spoon, or some other some necessity. And for a day's ration or 2 days' ration, they would make, like in this case, a spoon. And indeed, on my birthday, my dad, at a certain time of day, threw a wooden spoon that cost him probably several days of food over the fence for me, for my mother to catch. That was related by this Polish electrician. When that happened, maybe he had someone else throw it, whatever. My mother ran, not very close, but closer to the fence, which was electrically charged, to pick up the spoon. But an SS guard noticed that there was someone running towards the fence and shot. Missed her, thank goodness. The word got around that a woman wearing a scarf ran towards a fence. People made scarves out of little rags that they found here and there. And a search went on for a woman wearing a scarf. I never got the spoon. She had to drop it. And I always think of it as the most loving birthday gift that I almost got. Well, what happened in our barrack was that other women would tear a piece of whatever they had and put on scarves so that when they were looking for a woman wearing a scarf, she could not be found. Of course, they could have shot everybody, but just so happened they didn't. So I just wanted to tell you that about Stutthof. Now it's Mother and I, and we are being relocated again on a train, less horrendous than the others, and we arrive in the city of Dresden in Germany to work in a metal and munition factory. I'd like to tell you a little about it, because this is where I found out how come Mother and I stayed together, and how come my dad also survived, which we didn't know. We knew in Stutthof that he was probably there, but very ill. We lived and worked in a factory. We were still watched by the SS from the Flossenburg concentration camp. But here is the story. The ghetto's German dictator, the chairperson, whatever his title was, his name was Bebov, had an idea, not unlike Oskar Schindler, that he would move the metal factory from the Lodz Ghetto to Germany. They were at this point in need of workers for the war effort. First, he was going to move this factory closer somewhere to the Czech side in Sudetenland, but the Russians were approaching. So he decided on moving the factory to Dresden, Schorndauer Straße 68. That used to be a cigarette factory, and it was converted to metal and munition factory. Mother and I were working there. Anytime they could use you for labor, you got a little bit more food. We had actual bunks to sleep on, and we had a little more food. It was in that factory where one night, February the 13th, Mother and I were working night shift in the basement of the factory. I was almost 12. I was sorting bullets, and my mother was working on making some holes in some sheets of metal, when the worst bombing with conventional weapons of World War II occurred, and we were locked in this metal and munition factory. Books, articles have been written about the bombing of Dresden. It has become controversial, but I must tell you a little about it, because it was an unbelievable, horrific experience. Our building, as many others, were hit not with explosive but incendiary bombs. Everything was on fire. Everywhere, everything. The SS never for a minute lost watching us. That was more important than their own lives. They got us out of the building, where the whole street, everything was on fire, and that fire created this windstorm, which is difficult to describe. I remember the noise it created when the sheets of metal went up and down on this concrete floor. We went out into this. The black boots never lost sight of us, and they marched us through this totally burning city to outside the city, where we stayed on this meadow. 2 young women managed to escape in this chaos. One was caught and brought back, and we had to watch as she was tortured and killed. Nobody escaped after that. Now, we stayed there. I don't think they knew what to do with us. They took us back to what's left of the ruins of the factory and in Pirna, and then we started what is now known as a death march.
Let me ask you, you said the burning of Dresden has become controversial. What is the controversy?
Very interesting. I was in Dresden, as I mentioned earlier, and I'll tell you more about it, invited by the city with some others of us who are still around, who were in that factory. The mayor put a plaque on the building and so on, and I spoke to German students.
So you came back in what year?
2002, I think that's when it was.
2002. Okay,
yes,
that's your visit.
I think so. And I will tell you what I told the students who asked me then. This was a horrendous thing. Many people, innocent German people, women, children, everybody, died during this firebombing. And I was asked, how did I feel? What do I make of it? And there is a controversy. There are some people now who consider this a war crime. And what I said, I feel to this day, it was awful. war is hell. It was terrible. But I told them, had Germany, the Nazi regime, not invaded and occupied and tortured many people in all the countries of Europe, the English and the Americans would not come and bomb Dresden. So to us then, as scary as it was, and many thought that we would die in the fire, this was our very first time that we thought maybe there really is someone who's trying to help us. We were so naive. I was. I thought nobody knew about us. If they did, wouldn't the Americans and other people come and rescue us? This was a sign that while we may indeed die, which we probably would anyway, everyone believed this except my mother, or so she told me, our tormentors would be also killed along with us. And in those days, that was a sign of hope. And when I explained this to the German students, they, in a way, agreed. Many are questioning their grandparents' role in allowing Germany, this cultured, beautiful country of great composers, great architecture, great artists, highly educated, to commit these atrocities against people in all German-occupied countries. This is how I feel about Dresden till now. In this world, there are consequences. In other words, I will repeat, had Germany not committed these crimes and invaded all those European countries, certainly Americans and the British wouldn't come and bomb Germany. That was the way wars were fought.
Wow, that's a huge concept to put your mind around, that all that had to happen in order to bring the Allied forces to bomb Germany.
That was then warfare. It is now different. This was called Teppich system. They bombed the whole city. Now, mind you, so did the Germans. You know what happened to London, for instance. That was what Eisenhower and the British saw as a way to stop the Germans. The Russians were fighting on the Russian front. You know, of course, our heroes that landed in Normandy. And this was to end the war. This was to get the people against their own regime. War, as I said, it's horrible.
Let me bring you back into the factory. You were in the basement, you said, and then the fire broke out.
Yes.
Did everybody around you also escape? I mean, the very fact that you got out of that is a miracle.
It's unbelievable, as much of everything that I remember, because being in these camps, it's one thing. And then I was there during what Germans experienced from bombings. So it was just horrendous, but they got us out somehow. And when I was back in Germany, in Dresden, a few years ago, we went through that basement. By the way, it is now again a cigarette factory. And we went the stairs that went up from the basement. They're still all there. Here is something that's so important about Dresden. While there, I was given, as were the other people with me. They were people from England, from Australia, from Israel, the U.S., Czechoslovakia. There were 20 some of us. We were given the documents from the day that we left Lodz. All of us on the same transport, going the same route, the same camps, ending in Dresden, with the metal factory. My father did not work in the metal factory, but he had some connections. He knew some people, and we were put on the list to go with the metal workers. We were originally supposed to go to the metal factory after leaving Lodz, but as in Schindler's story, we ended up in Auschwitz, in Stutthof, and eventually in Dresden. And that's why I was with my mother, as were some other children, on that list to go to Dresden, so we were not taken away and murdered in Auschwitz. Some were, because there was lots of confusion going on.
So that's why you escaped Auschwitz.
That's right. That's right.
There was a mission. There was a reason for you. They wanted you to work in the metal factory.
Yes, absolutely. We both had this metal factory, and I have all the documents. And right now, I feel chills thinking about it, because for all these years, I didn't know. And I tried to search for it, because I knew I was in that factory, but I didn't know any people. And while we were on this trip to Dresden, I met people who were with us on the same transport. I will tell you about one woman that I met on this return trip a few years ago to Dresden. We were on a bus retracing our route of the Death March. And while we're on the bus, a lady is sitting next to me, and we start speaking. She's still speaking Polish. She lives in Herzliya, Israel. But people had this Polish connection. They were speaking Polish with each other. And I said, please, I don't remember Polish anymore. Speak English or German, which I know. They said, you don't speak Polish? And I said, no, I live in Oklahoma. There just isn't an opportunity to speak Polish. So this lady sitting there, she starts speaking to me in English. She knows English. And we exchanged our names, and she heard my maiden name, Wolman, and she said, Wolman, die Wolmanowa. In Polish, a woman's name changes. It's different from a male. The Wolmanova, my mother. She says, I remember her. And she had a little girl with her. She always had a little girl with her, and that's you. And we embraced. Wow. And I am in contact with that lady to this day.
Yeah. Tell me again, when the fire broke...
Yes.
Why did the fire break out in that factory again? You may have
Everything was burning.
Why? From
Incendiary bombs.
That were being dropped by...
The Allies. The British and the American. This was one of the bombings by the Allies, but specifically British and American. The firestorm, there were two times, and it pretty much erased that very beautiful city. But this is what I meant when I said that we, the prisoners, the workers in that factory, felt that there was someone that wanted to win the war to help us. Yeah. I didn't know it until then. How could this be going on if the world knew? Yeah. So if I may, I like to tell you what happens now. After a while, they decided to walk us to an unknown destination. And this is now March 1945, after the bombing of Dresden. And we walk along the river Elbe. Days and days, and people who can no longer walk and collapse are shot on the spot. We were weak, sick, hungry. We kept walking. It seemed like eternity. Nights we spent often in open soccer stadiums. And while we're walking, a nail in my left wooden shoe, I still had the wooden shoes, embedded itself on the side of my left foot. I was in terrible pain. And I begged my mother. Always we walked in fives. It's called the Death March. We were dragging along. We weren't marching. My mother on my right side, always myself and 3 other people were walking. I begged her to stop because I was in such pain. She asked the SS woman, not German, she was from the Ukraine, Katya, if we could stop for a minute so she could pull that nail out of my foot and get it with the rock out of the shoe. And Katya said 9. she shouted 9, and you don't ask again. And Mother kept pulling me along until we finally got to the stadium where she was able to get the nail out of my foot and out of the shoe. Some rag torn off what we were wearing wrapped around it. How I didn't get blood infection, I will not know. I have a scar there to this day, a mild reminder. But I must tell you something else during this walk. It was dusk, walking through a very picturesque little German town, always middle of the street. I remember seeing, curtains behind windows and lights and thinking, I will never live like that probably again. These people have beds, families, food. A German man, a civilian, came from somewhere, came right behind my mother and handed her a piece of bread. And I always tell the students, or anyone for that matter, this man was a hero. Had he been noticed by the guard, he would have been shot on the spot. So when I tell the kids to remember and learn about these monsters, Hitler and Goebbels and Eichmann and all the others, to also remember people such as Miep Gies, who saved Anne Frank, such people as Raoul Wallenberg, Oskar Schindler, and this unidentified German civilian who dared to give a Jewish woman a piece of bread.
Didn't you hear that your father was also marching?
Well, we heard, but we didn't see anybody. They were just the women. We didn't know if that was a rumor at that point or not. There were some women saying that the men are also marching, but who knew? Who knew? And the last we heard from this Polish guy was that my father was very ill. So we're walking, what I have since found out, I had no sense of time, was 11 days. When we arrived in a most unusual ghetto camp called Theresienstadt, in Czech, Terezin. It's close to Prague. I remember that there were windows in these barracks, in these buildings, really. Seeing a window in a camp, wow, that was so unusual. But it was there on May 8th, 1945, which happens to be the last day of the war. We were liberated by Russian soldiers.
How long then were you in Terezin before you were liberated?
Very short time. I don't know how long. And suddenly, the word got around that the SS is gone. And we could hear the tanks approaching. And they were Russian soldiers who gave us food. That's all we wanted was food. And people ate, myself included. We ate and ate. See, starvation cannot be explained, and I never tried to do it. But we just ate. Many people became violently ill. Some died because our stomachs were not used to all this food. But that's what people wanted to do. We just wanted food, and the Russians gave it to us.
The feelings that had to be coming over you.
It was a moment or a time of disbelief for me. I'll only speak for myself. I couldn't believe. What do you mean over? You're free. The Russian soldiers told us you're free. Well, what now? What happens? The first thing was, like I said, eating, and then people searching for relatives. That went on for years. It is still going on. I still attend a conference, which I will again in November, where people are still, how many years after the war? 65 years later. There's still some people who are looking for their true identity, because those children, the majority who survived in hiding under false identities. In this incredible chaos and all, we found out that my father was there, were the men on the other side, and of course everybody who was able to run and to walk, we were reunited. Most unusual story.
Can you bring us there? You saw your father. Now you're 12. He hadn't seen you now for all these many years.
It was just, really there weren't words exchanged, just hugging and crying, hugging and crying. And then for many people, and for us, once we overcame the initial shock, was, what about other family members? What happened to them? I mean, we were a family. I had cousins, uncles, aunts. My father had a sister. What happened to all of them? And then the search started, which consumed everybody. First, we were unable to move. We were skeletons, and we were so, how shall I say, just too weak to anything. So we stayed in Theresienstadt. And once we're able to move, people wanted to go home, to Lodz, my home, our home. Mind you, there was no transportation. You didn't go to a train station and buy a ticket. People moved around, walking, hitchhiking. People were moving in all directions. Those Germans, the Volksdeutsche, the ethnic Germans from Poland and Czechoslovakia, were being sent back to Germany. And all the camps, people who survived in all kinds of conditions, were trying to find home, wherever that was. It was a time of unbelievable tumult and confusion, really confusion. But by the time we were able, sort of, to think of going back, word came from Poland that some people who went back were not welcome. The town of Kielce in Poland, some people returned, and they were killed because their former neighbors did not want to part with all their belongings that they looted from the homes of the Jewish neighbors. Very complicated, very complicated. It's unbelievable. And I shouldn't say unbelievable because to me everything is believable. And I don't know if I should interject, but I will. When I came to this country in all these years, this happened over there, not in America. The United States, this was the country of liberty, of freedom, of people being true to their what we thought was human nature. Atrocities didn't happen here. Of course, there would be somebody, someone got shot or this or that, but nothing organized. We weren't perfect. There was slavery here. And when I came to Oklahoma, I learned about the American Indian. Horrible things happened, but Americans came out of it. Eventually, after all this, realized their mistakes and tried to make it right. And I'm a very proud American citizen and an Oklahoman. This accent, don't let it fool you. I am, after all these years, I'm an Oklahoman. And then what happened, which changed much of my thinking, or reinforced my thinking, was 9/11. Because the unimaginable that happened in Europe on a different scale, in a different way, something unimaginable happened in the United States, where innocent people were murdered, and it has influenced me ever since. I remember watching when those towers collapsed and seeing ashes and all that we all watched in disbelief and thinking there are human beings who were trapped on the airplanes and in the buildings. Who could imagine such a thing? Who could imagine that gas chambers were built and people murdered in them in Europe? Who could imagine that airplanes would be hijacked and people would be murdered in the United States? It affected me deeply.
you realized our country, the United States, is vulnerable too, and continues to be vulnerable to this very day in October of 2010.
I think so. I know so. Mm-hmm. And that has influenced me, as I said, because something like this wouldn't happen in America. Well, I have come to the conclusion, unfortunately, after Auschwitz and after this horrendous killing that happened in our own country, I think anything is possible. Yeah. And I do believe that most people can be brainwashed, and enough propaganda can influence them, unfortunately, to commit terrible acts of brutality against other human beings.
Yeah. Okay, so take us after the Russian troops liberated you, and you were looking for family members, wondering where you're going to go, then perhaps became afraid to go back to Lodz because you heard others had gone back to their communities and were actually killed. What decisions are made then?
What now? Well, first, many of us got a ride to Prague, and the capital of what was then Czechoslovakia. And in Prague, the Red Cross and other agencies set up stations where many people that were that part of the world who survived the camps came to Prague. At the train station and in hotels, food was distributed. I remember my first bath. I remember getting some clothes and sitting at the table and eating with my mother. My dad was very ill, and he physically and to a point emotionally never quite recovered. But my mother was tower of strength through all this and again now. And so we were in Prague. Now what do? Can't stay here, but had to stay long enough to regain some strength. And then they decided that my father's uncle, the legendary Uncle Leon Goldman, brother of my grandmother Wolman, lived in Lausanne, in Switzerland. And the aim became to reach him. But how? What do you do? There was no way. So then started a journey, which is an unbelievable story on its own, and I won't go into all of it. We were in the Russian zone. We were in Czechoslovakia, and then we were in the Russian territory, so to speak. And to get to the American-occupied areas of Germany was just the aim of everybody.
Were the Russian soldiers kind to you, sweet to you, always accommodating?
I had no bad experiences. Those first Russian soldiers who gave us food, they were very good to us. I have since heard stories that the Russians, right after all this, were already closing the borders, and that the second wave of Russian troops, there were horrendous atrocities committed by them towards anybody. Again, we were just very enclosed, because you didn't know what to expect, who was your enemy, who was your friend, but it was known that the thing to do is in some way reach the American zone, which we did. We had nothing to carry, we had no belongings, and somehow we and some others managed to walk through the countryside into the Russian occupation zone of Germany.
Weren't you walking into the American?
We walked to the American, through a no man's land, so to speak.
So that was many days?
Oh, yes, many days. But we're used to this. At this point, we had some more strength, and we walked. And there were some others, too. You should know there's a wonderful book written by a historian, and her name is Ruth. Oh, I'll think of it in a minute. I'm so sorry. And also a book written by a Tulsan, a history professor at TU, Dr. J. Geller, about being safe for Jews. The safe place after the war was in Germany. The book that Ruth has written is called Safe Among the Germans. Why? because that was the place where the English, the French, and the Americans set up the displaced persons home, the camps, DP camps. They were set up to help those who survived the camps, the German concentration camps. And those DP camps were set up in Germany. And that was the safe place to be, under the protection of the British, the French, and the Americans. So you see, the story continues. On our way somehow to reach Uncle Leon, traveled on whatever way was available, hitchhiking. Everybody was on the move. And then we spent a night in a German town not far from Stuttgart. We were traveling towards Stuttgart, and we hitchhiked a ride on a truck. It was evening, and the driver of the truck said, you know, Stuttgart is bombed. You won't find a place to spend the night. But we're going to drive through this little town, 14 kilometers from Stuttgart, called Ludwigsburg. It's in Baden-Württemberg. That town has not been bombed because traditionally large cities were bombed, small towns were left standing. And he says, I'll drop you off here, spend the night. He told us what to do, and then tomorrow you can continue your trip to Stuttgart. He dropped us off by these tall stairs in front of a church in Ludwigsburg. I remember that so clearly. And as we got off the truck, my father grabbed his chest, and he fell. And Mother told me to stay with him, and she ran for help. And it's in Ludwigsburg, by chance, never heard of the place before, that we, after all kinds of long struggle, stayed. And it is in Ludwigsburg in 1952 where I met an American soldier, Eva Unterman, who became my husband, and that is how I came to the United States.
Your father, then, he grabbed his heart. What was happening?
Well, Mother ran for help. And this wasn't far from the mayor's office in that city. And what happened in those towns was that when the Nazis fled, whoever the mayor was and his cronies, they fled. And the occupation force installed people who were in the opposition to the Nazis. They were known or brought them in from France or somewhere and installed them as burgermeisters, as mayors of these little towns and big cities. So first they got someone to take care of my dad. He suffered a heart attack. And I don't know if I should even go into all this that happened afterwards because it's also unbelievable. There was no plan. You just tried to survive. Okay, the war is over. We are no longer hunted. But now we have to eat. You have to have a roof over your head. And there we were in Ludwigsburg, where there were no other Jewish people. And the mayor, who was installed by the French, he wanted to help us. He became a friend. And the story from then on just takes on all kinds of strange circumstances.
Your father, did he survive that heart attack?
Yes, my father did, but he was very weak.
Is that where your parents continued to live in
Correct.
Until their death?
Yes, they tried to leave. We were on our way to Cyprus, to go to Israel. All kinds of things happened, but eventually they returned to Ludwigsburg, where there was safety and life. My brother was born there in 1948. It was always just for time being, just for time being. And then when they realized that, you couldn't go anywhere right away, it's just for time being, what to do with me? I just had a little bit of schooling, and I was 12 years old. No one knew what to do with me. I was concerned about one thing, to look like a girl. My hair was just beginning to grow in. And I wanted to be like all the other girls. And we didn't talk about the past. Very few people did. That is true of many survivors and American veterans. People just wanted to go on living. And the past was not talked about. No one asked and no one talked. Most people who survived were late teens and early adults, those that were strong enough, young adults. Old people, there weren't any old people who survived, and very, very few children. Were it not for the factory, I wouldn't be here now. So in Bergen-Belsen, those people who survived lost their families, husbands, wives, and of course the children. Within a very short time, they found a mate, were married, and had children very soon afterwards. The highest rate of babies born was at that time in the 40s after the war in the DP camps, particularly in Bergen-Belsen. And I was involved in bringing a program about it to Tulsa. I have books on it. There was this need to live. It's a very strong impulse among humans. And we see it, I'm a gardener, in nature also. Jewish people traditionally have overcome nothing like this, but horrendous tragedies, and went on. And that was the focus of most, to go on.
You were 19 years old
Correct.
when you met your husband,
Correct.
Herb?
Mm-hmm.
What's going on in your life between 12 and 19? Are you getting an education then?
Well, like I started saying, they didn't know what to do with me. I spoke Polish, a little bit of German. They couldn't put me in first grade. So they decided to put me in a German school, just for time being, with my contemporaries. And I had private tutoring all along. And I attended school in Germany, in Ludwigsburg, and I also took classes in Stuttgart at the Akademie der Bildenden Künste and Art School. I loved art, drawing. You know, kids now sit and play video games. I used to either read or draw and paint and do that sort of stuff. My formal education is limited by those years. But I've always been an avid reader.
So your contemporaries were ahead of you in their education.
Oh, totally.
I
didn't even speak the language. And besides German, in those days, in German high schools, there weren't any electives. You weren't given these choices. So besides German, which of course these kids grew up with, I had to learn English and French. And I learned quickly. And I think that when kids are motivated, they learn quickly. It wasn't easy.
So did you continue through a high school education?
Yes.
You did graduate from high school then?
In a way, yes.
In a way.
In a way. I did never get the Abitur, but I went all the way through with my contemporaries.
Right.
When it came to history, to language, I did quite well. Math was a puzzle to me then, and, well, I'm better at it now.
But the fact that you were a natural student, you were a reader, you enjoyed books, you educated yourself.
Absolutely, yes. And I still do. I'm a curious person by nature, and history has always been my favorite subject.
By the time you met your husband and then came to the United States in 1953, your parents had passed away by that time?
No.
Okay, so you left them then,
That's
both
right.
of them. Both of them were living at the
That's
time.
right. That's right.
And was that the last time you saw them?
No.
Okay, tell us.
Well, my husband and I met when he was stationed there. As I said, he was an American soldier. He was stationed in Germany during the Korean War. We met. My parents at that point had a little shop, which originally was for the Allied troops only, and it's another unbelievable story. This mayor that my mother and father befriended, the Frenchman, had an idea, since we couldn't go anywhere. Now, there was an attempt. We were going to Israel, as most Jews wanted, America or Israel. America was impossible, the United States, I should say, was impossible to get a visa to. We were all stateless at the end of the war. All concentration camp survivors were stateless. But when it came to immigration, we were on the quota of the country of our birth. I would probably be still waiting. Everybody wanted to come to the U.S. and to what was then Palestine. But there was the Jewish brigade of the Haganah, the Jewish army that was forming in then Palestine, the region called Palestine. And they made attempts to bring some survivors over. The ship, the Exodus, you know that story. It was made into a film, and I met Ruth Gruber, who wrote about it originally. Anyway, we too, my family, wanted to go to Israel. First America, but Israel, Palestine. And we joined this group, and as we were traveling on this truck, it was on that truck that my mother, who always spoke with strangers, started speaking with the Haganah soldiers, the Jewish soldiers who were helping to transport us illegally. And we were heading towards Cyprus, which was a camp for people to stay, for the survivors mostly, to show the need for a homeland. And as we were approaching a city, and Mother spoke with him, he says, you know you're going to a camp. No telling when you'll go to Israel, to Palestine. It was Eretz Israel. That's been the traditional name by Jews in Europe for a long, long time. Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. My mother knew she had 2 brothers there, but couldn't get in touch with them. But when she told this Haganah soldier who her brother was, especially one, he knew him. And he said, you don't want to go to Cyprus. You'll be in a camp there, and there is sickness, and there's terrible situation. My parents had no idea. And at this point, the word camp, they weren't going to go to a camp. We got off the truck outside Munich and hitchhiked a ride back to Ludwigsburg to Mr. Böhringer, the mayor, who was so happy to see us. And he had an idea. He found us a place to live, and he had an idea. All the stores were closed, no shops open. All the soldiers, the Americans, the French that were there, the occupation forces, wanted souvenirs. So he had the idea that there was a little store that some guy who owned it, some big Nazi, left. And with his connection and my mother's ambition and strength, could open a shop for the Allied soldiers only, which they did. There was no merchandise that one could buy, so we made souvenirs. Mother and I would sit at night, my father too, but he did more of the writing stuff, and she made her pillows out of whatever fabric he, the mayor, with his connections, could get. Again, she made her famous pillows. I would write souvenir of Germany on empty cardboard boxes that we got somewhere on pencils. We opened the shop like at noon. The word got around. There were soldiers, Americans. This used to be French territory. Then it became American. They sat on the sidewalk waiting for this shop, which was called Valeria, which was the name of the mayor's daughter, to open for a couple of hours. We sold our souvenirs, went home, and started making more souvenirs. And eventually, other stores opened, few, but they did. But Valeria stayed as a little gift shop. And it was in 1952 that this American soldier came in. Mother didn't know much English, but learned quickly. And any American soldier, they were our friends, our liberators. And this young man came in. I'll show you a picture of him. Mm-hmm. And he started talking to Mother, who didn't know much English, but that didn't stop her from talking. If they didn't understand her, that wasn't her fault. It was theirs. So she was just making conversation. And he showed her what he wore around his neck, which was a mezuzah. A mezuzah is a Jewish sign, just like the Star of David is a sign. He showed it to her. And wow, a Jewish American, that's instant family. And she, of course, invited him to go home. She would fix him a home-cooked meal. And this young soldier from New York, from Brooklyn, and I became friends. And then when he left, a few months after that, we continued to write. And he asked if I would come to the United States and we'd get married. Of course. What a question. First of all, he was so much fun to be with. Herb Unterman had a great sense of humor. He was an American. Anything American was to me magical. And I met people, soldiers and their families, and wow, that was the real good world. Then started this, well, how am I going to get papers? We didn't have any money, he didn't, we didn't. So he had an idea. His family had relatives in Toronto, in Canada. And I found out that it was much easier to get a visa to Canada. So under a false pretense, I managed to do that. And I left in late January 1952 on a ship, Cynthia Cunard Line, through Paris to Halifax, took a train to Toronto, where Herb and his parents waited for me. And we were married in the Holy Blossom Temple 2 days after I arrived on February 4th, 1953. And I had to stay 6 months in Toronto to get papers to come to the United States. And I then, of course, studied for the citizenship, which was very important to me and still is.
Where did you enter the United States?
We went to Niagara Falls and entered through there. On legal papers, I'm a legal citizen, and I have spoken to naturalization groups of people who became citizens, and I never take anything in this country for granted. I appreciate what it stands for and believe in it. Of course, now I have lived here so long, but it's so easy for people to take it for granted. Wow, there is no place on earth like the United States. There are people who are unfortunate, but the idea of the U.S., that everybody has a chance to persevere, to make whatever dreams they have possible, it is just as real now as it was when I came here in 1953.
Then you settled down where?
Oh, that would be too easy. I've never lived anywhere that I've heard of the place before. Now, my husband is from New York. And even though I'm married to an American citizen, I had to stay in Canada 6 months. He was then managing a store with a company called Lynn's. By the time I came to New York, he was transferred to Charlotte, North Carolina. Never heard of it before. But here, his parents picked me up and showed me New York, Statue of Liberty, and all this, and then we drove to Charlotte. Well, all I knew about American South is from reading Scarlett O'Hara, Here I Come. You know, it was that kind of a naive feeling, but a beautiful feeling. So we were in Charlotte. From Charlotte, we moved back to New York, and from there to Amarillo, Texas, where my son, Steve Unterman, was born. From Amarillo, we were transferred to Pampa in the panhandle of Texas. You know where Pampa is? Mm-hmm. It is in the middle of nowhere. Mm-hmm. And we lived in Pampa and then in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. In those days, companies moved their store managers like the Army does. It was always to be an advancement.
What kind of store was this?
This was a junior department store.
And the name
in those days. Lynn's.
Lynn's. So then...
And then when we came back to New York, and my husband, when he was in Germany, I mean, he just talked about New York. Oh, you know, this great, great city. And it is a great city. But we realized that wouldn't be where we wanted to settle. I mean, I was in a state of shock coming from the Black Forest area of Germany to New York, but I adapt easily. It was an exciting time. We were young. What did we have to lose? Whenever we moved, we had nothing. We eventually bought a car. And then he got to know someone who owned Levine's department store. And we went to Amarillo and Pine Bluff and Tulsa with Levine's. It was a small department store, way out north, Pine and Cincinnati, something like that, up there. What happened then, once we came to Tulsa, this was where we were going to stay. Everything about the city appealed to us. To me, the trees, green country is true. And we stayed here. They wanted to transfer us again. We said no. Our son just turned 5 and started kindergarten, and we wanted for him to grow up in a place he would call home. Herb quit and went to work with Zales Jewelers, where he managed a store for over 25 years. When he retired from Zales, he worked part-time at Moody's in Utica Square.
And you worked?
And I worked for Brooks Brothers. Prior to that, I spent 11 years teaching preschoolers. I was director of Temple Israel Preschool when my daughter, who was born in Tulsa, turned 3 years old. I was doing that, working with young children, and then I wanted to do something else, went into retail, which I learned from my parents in that little shop in Germany.
I just want to ask you some overall reflective questions.
I hope I'm not talking too
you
much.
No. Oh, this is terribly interesting. Have you ever returned to Lodz?
Yes, I never really wanted to. But at the same time, when we were invited to Dresden, and again, I can look it up, but I'm pretty sure it was in 2002, Herb and I went to Lodz.
Did you find your house where you lived?
Well, this was an adventure that I have actually written about. Incredible story. I didn't want to go and didn't go to any of the concentration camps. I didn't want to see this for me. I think it's very good that people see it, but I remember what it was like, and I didn't want to go like a tourist going to see these places. But it was an incredible event. We connected with an organization called Our Roots in Poland, which is sponsored by the Lauder Foundation. And we had someone meet us in Warsaw when we arrived there. He took us around, showed us where the Warsaw Ghetto was, and all the things that I've read about it, I now saw. And then he drove us to Lodz. Odd as it was, I made the arrangements in Tulsa through a travel agent, and she suggested that we stay in the Grand Hotel on Pietrkowska ulica. As it turned out, that was a few buildings away from where my father grew up and where I lived with Grandma Wolman when I was first born. This is the main thoroughfare. And that building still stands. It's now an office building. So here we are walking, my husband and I, back and forth, and our guide made arrangements for us to see the building from the inside. I tried to remember. I remember standing as a child by the window looking out. That's what I tried to do and have the memories come back. Of course, much has changed. We went to the ghetto area. I looked for the well where I was hidden, never found it. Much has been changed. That ghetto area, Bałwoty, is still poverty-ridden, bad part of Lodz. It was very, very interesting and emotional. And staying in that hotel, the Grand Hotel, on this main thoroughfare, they were playing 1930s music, trying to preserve the before-the-war atmosphere. And with my father as a young man living so close to it, and my mother, she loved to dance. We sat there There's the dance floor. It was empty then, but there was the music. And I tried to imagine my parents as young people dancing on that dance floor in the Grand Hotel while dating.
Let's go back. Your mother and father then eventually died in...
Correct.
What years?
My father died in his 70s. Mother died at 81. And I will get the dates. I have them written down. I have no sense for numbers.
And you were here in the United States when they died? And
Yes,
you heard about
I did visit my parents. My mother came to visit twice. My father never did because he was never well enough. And I visited them several times. My father had ultimately Parkinson's. And the last time I saw him, he had hallucinations from L-Dopa, the medication then. And when I came into his room, he told me to hide, to run, because he thought of the nurses and the doctors as the SS.
You know, there's a whole study about the relationship between the Polish people and the Jews, which is extraordinary. These righteous Gentiles, they're called, risked their lives to save Jews.
Yes.
And yet there was plenty of anti-Semitism in pre-war Poland.
That's
Many
right.
Poles actually risked their lives to aid
Absolutely,
Jews.
yes. Because people, are people. And even though, unfortunately, the Catholic Church did not speak up, I don't think that would have stopped Hitler, but it would have encouraged more people to help their Jewish neighbors. Had the Pope, Pius XII, was it, spoken up in defense of the Jews. But there were considerations that it may anger Hitler. You see, the appeasement thing is a whole other issue that I won't get into. But have you ever heard of Irena Sandler? Have you heard of Life in the Jar? A play?
I think I have heard of that.
Yes. Well, here is a woman, a young Christian Polish woman who, with the assistance of an organization, saved 1,500 Jewish children, one at a time, smuggled them out of the Warsaw Ghetto, gave them new identities, taught them how to behave as Catholics, found places for them, one at a time. But what she did, which is most admirable, she saved their true identities and where they were hidden, and she put the little notes in a jar that she left under a tree at her home. What a wonderful, wonderful person. And then a teacher from Uniontown, Kansas, found this story some years ago and told it to his students. And they visited Irena when she was already in her 90s and have written a play, Life in a Jar, that's touring all over the world. Uniontown, Kansas, Irena Sandler in Warsaw.
Despite the fact that the Allies in the United States put an end to all this, it took them a long time to finally be convinced that what was happening was actually going on. The mass killings, they were dismissed as exaggeration. And so the reports of 2 Jewish prisoners, I understand, who escaped Auschwitz in 1944, details were broadcast June 15th, 1944 by the BBC and then published by the New York Times.
Correct.
So it could not be ignored. It had to be dealt with. It took all that time. So does that go through your head?
Unlike what I thought, that if only the U.S. or the world knew, they knew. Yeah. But what I have read is a number of stories. First of all, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in this country. In the 1930s, there were strict quotas of how many Jews can enter. And President Roosevelt was very much aware what was going on. But from the accounts I read, his main vision and what he had to do was defeat Germany in the war. And by doing so, everything would be settled. Now, there were airplanes, American airplanes, bombing factories around Auschwitz, but didn't drop a single bomb on the railroad tracks. And people ask me often, what do I think about it? To be perfectly honest, I don't know if it would have made a difference. So instead of running the trains, they would walk people. They would find a method of killing us. United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor. It was not to rescue us. In reality, as I tell our dear friends, the American World War II veterans, because of what they have done defeating Germany, we were rescued. But that was not their mission. You know the story of the St. Louis ship, which we have in our Sherwin-Miller Museum. And I, again, was in charge of a program. In 1939, that was the last ship to leave Hamburg, Germany, for Cuba. And it took a great deal of persuasion and money to have these people leave Germany, most of them were children, for Cuba, where they were given asylum, were supposed to get asylum. Their parents, some relatives already were in Havana. But when the ship came to Cuba, the government changed its mind and did not allow them port of entry. There were 936 people on that ship. There were telegrams sent and phone calls and what have you to the United States 90 miles away to allow those people, the children, to temporarily come to the U.S. And the answer was, our immigration quota is full. We're not taking any more people in. And the ship had no choice but to return to Europe. Some countries, Belgium, Holland, England, and France, took some of the people. Those who went to England did survive. Those other countries, when they were overrun by Germany, the people were trapped again. I know a child who is now my age who was on the ship. He's with his mother. His father was already in Havana, Blumenstein, Henry Blumenstein. They went back. His mother found a hiding place for him in Holland, where he was in hiding and survived. She herself was killed in Auschwitz, 90 miles away from our shores. Immigration, bureaucracy, anti-Semitism, and everything else combined. Unfortunately, the U.S. did not set out to help the Jews.
Why do you think the Jews were hated so much?
That is an age-old question, and you are a historian also. Ever since the destruction of the Second Temple, we have been all over the world. And as far as why, much of it goes to, sorry to say it, Catholic Church's then sponsored anti-Semitism. And that goes back to the idea that the church perpetrated that the Jews killed Jesus. And as we, of course, know, Jesus was a Jew. And we respect Jesus. We only have one God. And it has been through the history, and it is now still going on, that this is the original hatred on which anti-Semitism was built. And I think there is more to it. There is some jealousy, because in many countries, Jews, by being studious and hardworking, have accomplished things and also maintained some traditions that were foreign, such as wearing certain clothes, covering the head. In Judaism, they are just like in Christianity, different traditions. There is the Orthodox branch, there are the conservatives, there is the Reform movement. We all believe in the one God, but we express our traditions in different ways. But there has been historically, and is again, the perception by people who hate Jews for all these reasons I just mentioned, that, the old stereotypical stuff that is again being on internet and other places. The Jews rule the world, the Jews are this, the Jews are that. there is a poster which shows a caricature of a Jew with the flag of communism, the old Soviet flag, and our American flag representing capitalism. And there are people who blame the Jews for capitalism and for communism at the same time. It shows the ridiculous assumption, but this is being perpetuated by different people for different reasons, and what has been traditionally anti-Semitism is now by many translated into anti-Zionism. In other words, hate the Jews, hate Israel. Israel can do no good, no matter what, in the opinion of others, not my opinion.
That brings me to the point here as we finish that for a long time you didn't speak out, but in 1978 you spoke for the first time to a classroom of students here in Tulsa. So you've been speaking out and you've been going to schools and speak out today here on this website, voicesofoklahoma.com. Tell us why you continue to speak out.
This is an obligation for me. For many years, I and others did not speak about this horrendous past, about the Shoah. We didn't speak, no one asked. And historians tell us that it takes about 50 years before something does become part of history. Who would have believed us then, our bizarre stories? Nobody would. And we wanted to go on, most of us, with our lives. We didn't talk, not amongst ourselves either. When I went to school in Germany in the late 40s, this wasn't mentioned. But the same here. My 2 children attended Tulsa public schools. It wasn't talked about. It just didn't exist. And I think for a number of reasons, it was too bizarre to believe, and our wounds were too raw to talk about it. Now there is an urgency of time. And I must tell you that this is what I am committed to, and have been gradually since 1978, when a teacher called me and wanted me to speak to his school. He's a history buff, and he taught about World War II and about the Holocaust, and that was the start. And then, even though it is not mandated in Oklahoma, I am committed to telling the story to young people, to impress upon them how we are capable of doing these incredible atrocities towards other human beings and hoping against hope. As we speak, there is Darfur and other areas where crimes are committed. But hopefully, young people will learn from our experience to speak up early on, to care about the other person, to become what my tradition teaches me human beings should be. We are all God's children, all on this little planet together, and if we are to survive as a species, we must learn not only to tolerate, but respect one another. I hope that our information, our testimony will in some way lead to making that reality.
It'd be fair to say that what you're doing here, because anti-Semitism still exists. That didn't go away in the 40s. It still exists here in 2010. That what you're doing and others like you are merely trying to keep it stomped down by talking about these atrocities and what we are capable of, so that the world is aware that even though this, should I say, flame of anti-Semitism is still burning, that we shall never, ever let it become a major flame. And that's why you're doing this.
Absolutely. You said it very, very well. And it is part of my tradition, as we do each year during Passover. We remember when we were slaves in Egypt. It is our responsibility to remember our past and teach others that freedom is something that we all must work towards for ourselves and for every oppressed person anywhere.
That's good. Thank you. Do you think because the Jews did not have their country, you were the wandering Jews, it was easy to dismiss, and here in the United States, here are the people who are the ones who liberated you, but they were also the ones who were very slow to embrace what was happening. That because if you had Israel as a country and it had to be dealt with as a country, then the plight of the Jews would have been different.
Absolutely. And that is something else that I am very much committed to. Israel is our security. Had Israel existed during World War II, during the years 1930s through 45, had we had a place to go, had we had a rescue that would take us in as people who belong to that land, in all Jewish history, in all Jewish religious services, and amongst people who aren't religious, Israel has always been at the very top of our consciousness. A Jew always prays to the safety of Jerusalem. It was a nation at one time, and through history as it happened, Jerusalem was destroyed. We were at the mercy of other countries. They could invite us in, they needed workers, or for whatever reason, and kick us out, and we would go somewhere else. All over the world, there are Jewish synagogues, places of worship, and Jewish history tied in, and wherever Jews have been, they took the culture of that country and influenced their ways of life. That is true of food. I'm often asked, what is the Jewish food? I say, well, it depends where you lived, Eastern Europe, or perhaps in Iraq or Iran or somewhere else. Different countries have made an influence, but we are steadfast about our own identity.
Right. And if Israel had been a state back through all this, you would have had a government who was speaking out for you at all times, and you just didn't have that.
That's right. Speaking out, yes, and also acting on our behalf. What I often tell the veterans, why I consider them so important in my life and our lives, there have been conferences, as they are now, usually in lovely places like somewhere in Geneva, and they discuss things and this and that. But you know, who liberated us? Soldiers. Sad, but true. In an ideal, utopian world, we could sit and discuss our differences and come to an agreement. But that's not where we are. And I think that Israel's strength as a country is very important. It's important to the United States to have an ally that part of the world. And it's very important for a number of reasons for Jewish people, no matter where we are. I'm an American, and I cherish being here, living in this country. And my children, my great revenge against Hitler, my children and my grandchildren are Americans. Judaism is our religion, but we have a close tie to the state of Israel, and many of us see the importance of it.
Yeah. Were you a religious family, and did it play a part in your survival?
No. Simple answer, but I will elaborate just for a minute. Having said so categorically no, my parents were very assimilated into the Polish culture, particularly my father's family. We only spoke Polish. Yiddish wasn't taught in my home. My mother comes from a more traditional Jewish family. That's why her two brothers left Poland early 30s as Zionists and went to Palestine. I always knew that I was Jewish, but we did not participate in all the Jewish festivals and celebrations. There were some. My parents were very choosy about it. We observed Passover. We observed Yom Kippur. They always said Kaddish, the prayer for the departed, people who died, their parents. And I always knew I was Jewish, but I did not have what I've come to appreciate living in this country, a Jewish community, being part of it, and observing Jewish holidays, which give me a great deal of pleasure.
That's what you're a member of now. You are a member of that religious.
I am.
Yeah.
And I'm most grateful for that. In Tulsa, we have a small but vibrant Jewish community, and I feel very much part of it. I have so much to be thankful for. I'm a very grateful person to be still around, to have wonderful children, son, daughter, their spouses, and great-grandchildren, Sophie, Phoebe, and Jacob.
Yes, you are very fortunate, and I know you're very grateful.
And I'm grateful to you for doing this, for asking me these questions, and having the opportunity to speak about it. I really feel good about being part of the Oklahoma community. So I thank you very much.
Thank you. You did a wonderful job. Let's just say a word about the book. A book has been published about your life. Tell us about it.
Well, my granddaughter, Phoebe, to whom, by the way, I didn't talk about my story when she was a youngster, but I was invited to come to Kansas City when Sophie, who was 2 years older than Phoebe, was in 6th grade or 5th grade, I don't recall. And Phoebe was allowed to come to the class to hear her grandmother speak. And then years later, when Phoebe was 13, she was given an assignment to write a story. She's always been writing and illustrating. Both my kids are artistic, I think. They're very talented. And she thought, and then one day she decided to write the story based on my childhood. And she really wanted to do it only up to the war, my childhood before the war. But her teacher wanted to know more, didn't want to end it right there, in 1939. And Phoebe worked on this, writing and illustrating. She entered a contest through a publisher, Landmark Publishing in Kansas City, and she won. And the book was actually published last November. It is called Through Eva's Eyes. She wrote and illustrated it. It's for children primarily. She was very sensitive in telling my story, doing research on her own. It is appropriate for kids, I would say, from 5th grade and up. It tells the story without all the cruelty described that I was talking about. It's for kids. I'm very, very proud of her for doing this. There's a great deal of interest in it. Phoebe and I were invited by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. for a book signing. She has her own website. It is through Eva's Eyes Online.com, where she tells about the process that she underwent and the story. So, again, lucky me. What more can one wish for?
Well, as the Germans took the young children away because they were the future, this book is for the children here because they are the future.
That is so beautifully said. I'm going to write this down. I could never come up with anything so eloquent, and I thank you for saying that.
Yeah. To hear the story told, I've never sat down and talked to anybody about it before. Now the story is preserved. Thank you, Eva. You did a wonderful job.
Thank you. Thank you so very, very much. I truly appreciate it. And what can I say? This has been an incredible experience for me. You have asked the most important questions.
You have been listening to the Voices of Oklahoma podcast. Stories taken from the oral history website, voicesofoklahoma.com. At the website, you will discover an array of storytellers. Many you will know. Some will be new to you, but all will be worth your time. This work depends on listeners like you, who are interested in learning about the great people of Oklahoma. Our website provides an opportunity to donate to this 501c3 project, which preserves Oklahoma history, one voice at a time. voicesofoklahoma.com.